Dr. Helen Graves had attended hundreds of estate auctions in her career, most of them predictable affairs filled with tarnished silverware, moth-eaten upholstery, and framed portraits of strangers whose names had long ago slipped from memory. The September air in Charleston clung to her skin that morning, heavy with salt and decay, as she slipped into the back row of a narrow auction house that smelled faintly of mildew and lemon polish. She almost hadn't come. The listing mentioned furniture, not documents. But a single line in the catalogue of assorted photographs, early 1900s, rural low country, had unsettled something in her, the instinct of a historian who knew that the smallest artifact sometimes carried the heaviest truths. When Lot 47 was presented, it drew little interest. A wooden box, scratched and unremarkable, filled with sepia-toned prints curled at the edges. The auctioneer's voice bounced lazily off the tin ceiling. $50 to start. Helen raised her paddle with the distracted confidence of someone who expected competition. There was none. The hammer fell at $75. That evening, in her cramped university office, she lifted each photograph from the box one by one. Stiff-backed families. Unlabeled landscapes. Children standing beside dogs whose names would never be known again. Then she found the porch portrait. A black family of 5 in their Sunday best, posed with careful dignity before a modest wooden railing. The father stood tall, his hand resting lightly on his wife's shoulder. 3 children stared directly into the lens, their expressions too composed for their ages. On the back, in faint pencil, 2 words, The Crossing. Summer 1912. It was the father's vest that caught her eye first. A glint beneath the fabric. She adjusted her desk lamp, angling the light until it struck the photograph at a shallow slant. There, barely visible, was the curve of polished silver. A compass. She leaned closer, breath slowing, pulse rising. The needle was not aligned as it should be. It angled downward in the frame, pointing not north, not east or west, but directly toward the smallest child seated at the edge of the porch. Helen told herself it was a distortion of perspective, a trick of aging chemicals and warped paper. Yet the more she studied it, the less accidental it appeared. The father's posture was subtly turned, the vest parted just enough to reveal the instrument. It was positioned to be seen. Deliberately. Almost defiantly. Dr. Helen Graves had not planned to attend the estate auction that humid September morning in Charleston. Her calendar was already crowded with lectures, grant proposals, and a noon conference call she could not afford to miss. The auction house was known more for antique armoires and chipped porcelain than for archival discoveries. Yet a single line in the printed catalogue had unsettled her, a wooden box of early 20th century photographs recovered from a demolished rural home in the Low Country. Something about the phrasing felt careless, almost dismissive, as if a century of memory had been reduced to clutter. On impulse, she drove downtown, telling herself she would stay only a few minutes. By the time Lot 47 was raised for bidding, most of the serious buyers had already spent their budgets. The box itself looked ordinary, its hinges rusted, its corners worn smooth by decades of handling. When the auctioneer called for $50, the room remained quiet. Helen lifted her paddle. No one challenged her? The hammer fell at $75, sealing a decision she would later describe as instinct rather than intention. That evening, alone in her office, she opened the box beneath the yellow glow of her desk lamp. The photographs inside were brittle and curled at the edges, their sepia tones fading into soft browns and ghostly grays. She spread them across her desk, cataloguing each one with practiced efficiency. Most were predictable, stiff family portraits, overexposed landscapes, children posed beside livestock. Then she found the image that halted her breath. A black family of 5 stood on a narrow wooden porch, dressed in formal Sunday attire. The father's hand rested gently on his wife's shoulder. 3 children sat in rigid stillness, their gazes fixed on the camera with an intensity that felt almost rehearsed. Turning the photograph over, Helen found faint pencil marks on the back, The Crossing. Summer 1912. The words troubled her. She knew the geography and history of South Carolina's black communities intimately and had never encountered a place formerly known as the Crossing. She retrieved her magnifying glass, leaning close enough to catch the scent of old paper. That was when she noticed the faint glimmer in the father's vest pocket. A metallic curve, barely distinguishable from the dark fabric. Adjusting the lamp, she studied it carefully. A compass, small and silver, its casing engraved with delicate patterns. But what unsettled her was the angle of the needle. It did not align as any compass should. Instead of pointing north, it appeared directed downward within the frame, toward the youngest child seated at the edge of the porch. She shifted the photograph under different light sources, testing for distortion. Each time, the needle held its position. The father's body seemed subtly angled to reveal the instrument, as though he wanted it visible but not obvious. The realization crept over her slowly, like the tide rising against marshland. This was not an incidental detail. It was intentional. Someone had posed this family with a message hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to uncover it. Marcus Webb arrived at Helen's office the following morning with the deliberate calm of a man who had spent for decades handling fragile truths. At 73, his hands trembled slightly when he set down his leather satchel, but his eyes were steady and penetrating. He had devoted most of his life to preserving black Southern oral histories, especially those that never made it into official archives. When Helen placed the porch photograph in front of him, he did not speak at first. He studied it in silence, lifting it toward the window where pale light filtered through the blinds. "Where did you find this?" he finally asked. Helen explained about the estate auction in Charleston, the wooden box, the faded note on the back reading The Crossing. Summer 1912, and the compass needle pointing unnaturally toward the youngest child. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression tightening with recognition rather than surprise. When she mentioned the word crossing, he exhaled slowly, as though a memory long buried had just been unearthed. He opened his satchel and pulled out a thick notebook, its pages yellowed and crammed with careful handwriting. 1986, he said, flipping through until he found the page he wanted. "I was cataloging oral histories in rural Beaufort County. Interviewed a woman named Dayla. Must have been close to 90 at the time. Sharp as a blade, though." He traced a line of ink with his finger. "She told me about a family that lived on the edge of the swamp. Said they weren't like other folks. Kept to themselves. Visitors came at night. Left before sunrise." Helen leaned closer. "What kind of visitors?" "She called them the walking wounded," Marcus replied. "Men running from chain gangs. Families fleeing debt peonage. People who'd slipped away from convict labor camps and needed to disappear before the sheriff's dogs caught their scent." He tapped the photograph gently. Dayla said her grandmother used to whisper about a place called the Crossing. Not a town. Not on any map. A way station. Helen felt a chill spread through her. But by 1912, the Underground Railroad was long over. Marcus gave a quiet, humorless laugh. The railroad never really ended. It just changed tracks. After Reconstruction collapsed and Jim Crow tightened its grip, new routes formed. They didn't call it the Underground Railroad anymore. Some called it the Midnight Road. Others the Freedom Line. But it served the same purpose. He gestured toward the porch in the photograph. Dayla's grandmother said there was a man who could read the stars and a woman who could fold messages into cloth. They helped dozens escape through the swamps. Helen stared at the family's solemn faces. "What happened to them?" "They vanished," Marcus said softly. "One day they were there. The next, gone. House empty. No bodies found. Just ash and rumors." He met her gaze. "If this is that family, you're not holding a portrait. You're holding evidence of a hidden resistance that operated right under the nose of Jim Crow law, and someone made sure their story was almost erased. The breakthrough did not come from the compass but from the cloth. Helen had already enhanced the digitized image to its highest possible resolution, isolating the mother's hands and enlarging the pale square resting in her lap. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a neatly folded handkerchief, the sort a woman might carry to church on a warm Sunday in 1912. But the closer Helen examined it, the clearer the geometry became. The folds were too precise, too symmetrical to be casual. Triangles nested within triangles, edges aligned with deliberate care. This was not decoration. It was structure. She contacted textile historians across the country, forwarding the cropped image and asking whether the pattern held any documented significance. Most replied cautiously. The theory of quilt codes guiding enslaved people to freedom had long been debated, often dismissed as folklore lacking material proof. Several scholars warned her not to read intention into coincidence. Fabric folds, they reminded her, could be shaped by habit as much as by design. Then she reached Dr. Rosalind Carter, a retired professor from Howard University known for her research into African diasporic textile traditions. When Dr. Carter saw the image during a video call, she fell silent for so long that Helen wondered if the connection had frozen. Instead, the professor leaned closer to her screen, her expression tightening with recognition. "This isn't a quilt pattern," she said at last. "It's older than that." She explained that along the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, certain black communities preserved elements of West African symbolic language well into the late 19th century. These systems did not rely solely on spoken words but on encoded visual forms, arrangements woven, stitched, or folded into cloth. Women in particular served as custodians of this knowledge, passing it from mother to daughter. The patterns could communicate warnings, safe passages, meeting times, even directions toward water routes invisible to outsiders. By 1912, most of these traditions had faded from public awareness, suppressed by forced assimilation and the violence of Jim Crow. But in isolated low-country communities, fragments endured. Dr. Carter pointed to the enlarged image on her screen. The nested triangles, she explained, formed a configuration sometimes referred to as a river door. It indicated proximity to a navigable waterway and signaled that escape by boat was possible nearby. In regions laced with marshes, creeks, and black water rivers, such knowledge could mean survival. Helen felt the room tilt slightly as the implications settled over her. The porch portrait was not merely commemorative. It was instructional. If mailed to someone beyond the reach of local suspicion, the image could function as a map disguised as family memory. The compass pointed directionally within the frame. The cloth confirmed a water route. Every detail was layered with meaning. Dr. Carter studied the mother's face one final time before ending the call. "She's not posing for posterity," she said quietly. "She's transmitting information to someone who knows how to read it." The first trace of catastrophe surfaced in a place few scholars bothered to search. Helen had exhausted census rolls, property deeds, and church registries without finding a definitive match for the family in the photograph. It was as if they had stepped briefly into visibility in the summer of 1912 and then dissolved back into shadow. Frustrated but unwilling to concede defeat, she turned her attention to black-owned newspapers from the era, knowing they often recorded events white publications ignored or distorted. In the archives of a historically black college, she found a fragile partial run of the Low Country Beacon, a paper that had once circulated quietly through Charleston and its surrounding rural communities. The pages were brittle, their edges crumbling beneath careful fingertips. She read them methodically, scanning columns of church announcements, business advertisements, and brief reports of violence too common to earn large headlines. On the third day, in an October 1912 issue buried near the back, she found a small article only 4 paragraphs long. The headline was restrained, "Fire Destroys Rural Home." The report described a farmhouse in a remote area of Colleton County consumed by flames late at night. The residents, a man, a woman, and 3 children, were missing. Authorities presumed they had perished, though no remains had been recovered from the ashes. The property name was listed almost casually, Crossing Creek Farm. Helen felt the word strike her like a physical force. Crossing. The article noted that the sheriff suspected arson but offered no suspects and no follow-up. The tone was perfunctory, as though the disappearance of an entire family required little investigation. She copied the date, October 1912, and began cross-referencing it against other regional records from that month. What emerged chilled her more than the article itself. In September 1912, just weeks before the fire, a nearby convict labor camp had reported 12 inmates missing. The camp's warden had issued notices offering a substantial reward for their capture. Local white newspapers described the escapees as dangerous criminals. There was no indication any had been apprehended. After that notice, the trail went silent. 12 men vanished in September. A farmhouse known as Crossing Creek burned in October. A black family of 5 disappeared without bodies recovered. The timing was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Helen called Marcus and read the dates aloud. He did not interrupt her. When she finished, he said only, "Someone talked." Or someone noticed too much movement on the river. If Crossing Creek Farm had indeed been a station on the hidden route they were uncovering, then aiding 12 escapees in a single month would have drawn dangerous attention. A bounty that high invited informants. The fire could have been retaliation, a warning to others who might consider offering help. Or it could have been an attempt to erase evidence before deputies arrived. Helen returned to the photograph, studying the rigid posture of the father, the folded cloth in the mother's hands, the children staring unblinking into history. If they sensed danger closing in, the portrait might have served not only as a map for others but as proof of what they had done before everything went up in smoke. Proving that the family had not died in the fire required Helen to think like someone running for their life. If Crossing Creek Farm had been destroyed in October 1912 and no bodies were recovered, there remained the possibility that the family had escaped using the same routes they once guided others along. The swamps and river corridors of the low country connected to rail lines that carried thousands of black migrants north during the early years of the Great Migration. Helen began tracing that path forward rather than backward, shifting her search to northern church archives where displaced families often resurfaced under new names. Her focus settled on Philadelphia, a common destination for refugees from coastal South Carolina. Church communities there frequently recorded baptisms, financial assistance, and letters of introduction for newcomers arriving under strained circumstances. In the auxiliary records of Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, she found a December 1912 baptismal entry that halted her breath. A family of 5, father, mother, and 3 children, had been baptized together shortly after arriving from the south. The first names were Samuel, Josephine, David, Elijah, and Ruth. No surname was recorded. A note in the margin stated only that they had come under difficult circumstances and wished to begin anew. The absence of a last name suggested deliberate reinvention. Helen requested access to supplementary church correspondence from 1913 and discovered a letter written in careful script addressed to the pastor. In it, Josephine described their safe arrival, her husband's work at a shipyard, her own washing taken in for income, and their nightly prayers for those who had helped them and those they could not save. She mentioned enclosing a photograph to be kept secure in case anything ever happened to them, insisting they were neither criminals nor cowards, only people who wanted to live free and help others do the same. The photograph itself was missing from the church file, but Helen no longer doubted she held that very image in her possession. Tracing their descendants required months of genealogical reconstruction. The family had adopted a new surname after settling in Philadelphia, blending into the anonymity that protected so many who fled the South. Eventually, Helen located Ruth's granddaughter, Gloria, living in a New Jersey nursing home. When shown the porch portrait, Gloria wept and confirmed the stories passed quietly through generations: a grandfather who navigated by stars, a grandmother who folded coded messages into cloth, and a porch railing marked with notches counting each soul guided toward freedom. According to Ruth's childhood memory, there had been 47 notches before they fled. 47 men, women, and children who slipped through the swamps and onto boats because Samuel's compass needle and Josephine's folded river door pointed the way. In recovering the photograph and returning it to the family, Helen did more than solve a historical mystery. She restored evidence of a hidden network of resistance that survived long after emancipation, proving that courage in the Jim Crow South did not always announce itself with speeches or headlines but sometimes stood quietly on a wooden porch, waiting for someone a century later to finally understand what they were seeing.